Well, today we're going to shift our focus from slaves or employees, if you will, to masters or people who are in charge, whether they're the employer who owns the business or they're a person who is in a management position. Keep in mind, people who are in management oftentimes are subservient to other people just as you are, and so try to be understanding of the context that they have to operate within. But Paul makes this comment in chapter 4, verse 1 of Colossians. He says, "Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven." If you look at really what are the tensions that often exist in businesses and in the marketplace, is the fact that oftentimes the compensation of people who are in charge is significantly higher than the people who are actually doing the work. And part of that is developed in our country because we no longer have a relationship between the income of a business and the product that they produce. In other words, basically, we've shifted from a manufacturing structure to really a monetary structure that people who run businesses as CEOs and presidents and board members, their primary thought is how do they expand the financial basis, and they are compensated based upon the expanding financial base or the increase in income within any period, not within the long range success of a business. And this has its positive and negatives, because when a business, people are running a business, they're always thinking about how do we position this thing to be continually profitable. And throughout history, there's been many businesses that once were very profitable, but they didn't change with the times. I mean, we use the illustration all the time about the guy who was making buggy whips, or I remember just reading recently some guy during World War I, his father was a saddle maker, and he was going to go back after the war and make saddles, and the general he served under said, "Well, you're fixed for life because there'll always be a need for saddles." And we look back on now and saying it's kind of a niche industry for a few artistic types, but saddle making is not a major industry anymore. What happened? Well, the market changed, the world changed, circumstances changed. People don't need buggy whips anymore. And so the bottom line is that there are advantages to these businesses, which are always saying, how do we maintain and continue to be profitable? At the other end, what happens is, on the negative side of it is, that they oftentimes become only concerned about the bottom line and how they can increase it. And what that means is they may reduce the quality or compromise the content of their product, or they may figure out ways to limit the expenses, and employees are the number one expense. And so they'll try to reduce overhead by cutting back on employees. And sometimes that's absolutely necessary. I mean, I know over the years of pastoring the churches, there are times where we've had to downsize because the economy was going in the tank and we just didn't have the income to sustain the staff that we had at that point. And it's a pretty difficult thing to go through and to tell people, we just can't pay your salary anymore. And believe me, I don't ever want to have to do that ever again. But the simple fact is that that's the reality of the marketplace, and it goes up and down. But at the same time, one of the questions that we try to keep on asking ourselves, even as a church, are we compensating our people fairly? Because one of the concerns I had as a pastor, and I had young pastors underneath me, I found that oftentimes, as I did in places where I served, that I moved on not so much because I was anxious to move on, but they were starving my family. They were not paying me enough to stay there. And, there was some men I served under who had this kind of attitude that God will keep them humble and we'll keep them poor. And that was always bothered me when I was in a position where I could retain staff, that I made sure that they were getting as much as we could afford to give them, that we were trying to compensate them rightly and fairly. And I would just say to you that the pastors and people who serve in your church, I know it's true in our church, I don't know what church you attend, but I'll tell you, our people work really, really hard, and if we paid them by the hour, we couldn't afford any of them, because they go above and beyond the call of duty, because they're there to serve God. They're not doing it for a paycheck. Most of them walked away from better paychecks to take the one that we give them. But I always have that concern because I want the young families on my church to be able to buy a house, to care for their kids, dress their kids adequately, be able to store up and build a retirement, and all sorts of things that weren't done for me when I was in a ministry. And I really, you come to this point, you look back and say, that was a real error, that there wasn't this honoring of those who were serving in the ministry. Well, I go off on a tangent there, but I just really, you may not be, I would say to you that we try to be as fair as we can with our people. And I wish I could be more fair. But you may be part of a church where that isn't happening. And I would just encourage you to prayerfully approach the leadership of your church and saying, are we really adequately compensating our staff? Because people have no idea. My wife pointed out she goes to the office twice a week, and I go into the office probably twice a week, but that doesn't mean I'm not working. In fact, here I am at home doing this, and I'm working constantly. And my wife said, the problem with being a pastor and being married to a pastor is you're kind of on duty 24/7. You never really can just be off the clock. So no matter where I am in the world, I find myself working on messages, preparing to give messages, to answering emails, all that stuff that goes with it. I'm not trying to make you feel sorry for me. What I'm trying to say is you have to understand that people who go into full-time ministry usually end up having to make huge sacrifices, almost as much as those who are in part-time ministries. Because I found when I was a part-time minister that I would work 40 hours or more a week, and then I'd come home and spend another 40 hours trying to prepare and respond to the needs of the ministry. So sometimes the people who are vocational part-time are working harder than even people who are compensated full-time like I am. Well, all of that to say, we need to be thoughtful about when we have people work for us that we're doing what's right and fair by them. I've had people have come and worked for me and done projects for me, and they so underbid the project that my wife and I felt we have an obligation to give them more than they asked because they did more. And we're thankful that they did what they did and they did it so well. But what they asked was not commensurate with what they did. And you may think that's crazy. You may be able to look and say, well, I've got it for a bargain. But really, I feel in my conscience I need to be careful that I'm trying to compensate people based upon what they did and what is fair, not based upon how much money I can save. I know there's a balance in everything. We need to be frugal. We don't want to be spendthrifts. But at the same time, we need to also realize that part of the benefit of being prosperous in life is that we can be generous as well. And you're not going to take it with you. You're not going to take it with you. My wife and I often talk about, it's like, do we want to have anything left over? We want to leave things to our kids if we have any things, but we don't want to have the illusion that somehow we're going to take this stuff with us. And he says, because what we know is, he says, you know that you also have a master in heaven. So here again, he puts the eternal perspective into it. One day you're going to leave this and you're going to be home with him. And if you're doing things, if you're compensating people and treating people with a mind that I'm going to have to give account to God the Father for how I'm doing this, then you treat people differently. In fact, in the parallel in Ephesians 6:9, Paul says this. He says, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him, that God doesn't treat you better than him. He doesn't like you better than him. And that was kind of the Pharisaical thought. That's the thought of many people. Well, the reason why I have this high position and this high income is because I'm better, I'm smarter, I'm more talented, and God likes me better, doggone it. Well, that's not true. God says that those who are poor are rich in faith towards God. And he says that as goods increase, so do they that eat them. And who sleeps best at night? The person who has enough to get by, or the person who is worried about losing what he has? Now, I grant it, not having enough will keep you away at night as well. And so God says, trust me, I will provide for you. But when you're in the position of being the one who supervises and provides, you have a responsibility to make sure that you're doing what's right in the eyes of God, what's pleasing in the eyes of God, and what is fair. Can you overpay people? Absolutely. You can make people lazy by overpaying them, but you can also underpay them and make it harder for them. And so I think that that's the issue, that if you're in the position where you control people's incomes, always be asking yourself the question, is it right? Is it fair? Again, in our situation, every January, our board looks at the compensation packages of every employee and tries to evaluate, are we being fair with them? And some of them have worked so very hard, so above and beyond anything we pay them, that we feel we have an obligation to show them that we're thankful and appreciative, and we try to do something special for them because we know that they did it for the Lord, but we also know that they need to be able to relax and catch the wind and be restored. And their wives and kids, our husbands, need to know that where they work, they're valued, and we appreciate what they do, and we have to recognize that they're having to make sacrifices for their loved one to work on our staff. So these are some of the things. These are kind of the ways that I process this stuff, and I'll just offer to you suggestions. But be right, be fair. Amen.